Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our weekly webinar, helping you with the COVID-19 information for your small business. I have been neglectful in not introducing my cohorts here. I have Joe and Vernon.
Hello,
We are your emergency COVID team. Trump has Fauci and I have Joe and Vernon. So thank you all for joining us. Today we're going to talk about the EIDL program. So we're going to give it a little breakdown. We're going to talk about the eligible expenses, the recommended best practices that we have. We'll discuss the repayment, some examples, and then we're going to follow up with a check-in about what we hear about today. So as you all know, or may have forgotten, like many of us did, initially when the CARES Act came out, there was an EIDL program out there, Economic Injury Disaster Loan in Advance. And we were all made aware that the advance was forgiven. It was free money. So everybody quickly went and went on the SBA website and applied for that grant. We originally thought that everybody was going to get $10,000, and then as the demand increased for that money, the money had run out, and we were made aware that it was intended to be $1,000 per employee, up to a max of $10,000. And of course, it didn't need to be repaid. So many businesses thought, oh, I didn't get the EIDL grant. And then over the last couple of weeks, we have been receiving calls from people saying, yes, I did get it. It showed up in my bank account. I got $6,000, I got $8,000. So we didn't want you to confuse the EIDL grant under the COVID-19 program with the traditional EIDL program that is still out there and available to everyone, in which you can borrow up to $2 million, has a 30-year payback and a rate of 3.75, which is not a bad deal.
And for the nonprofits out there, that rate is actually only 2.75 for you. Just for the for-profit entities, it is 3.75.
So the eligible expenses that we recommend you spend your EIDL grant on would be everything that is not covered under the PPP program. So with that, it could be some supplies, any inventory purchases, professional services, insurances, and repairs and maintenance. Even though the funds were designated as $1,000 per employee, there was no guidance whatsoever that said that that money had to be used on payroll. In fact, the guidance says that you cannot use it for the same expenses for the PPP. So please consider that. Best practices. Of course, we always recommend as accountants that we keep things separate, and with that, most likely meant a separate bank account. That's not always possible, it's not always feasible, and it could create more stress than it's worth. But of course, that is our recommendation. If you're audited, then giving an auditor one bank account with very specific expenses versus your operating account would make things go much smoother. Again, use the money for things that will not be forgiven. So avoid payroll and any utilities or rent. Repayment, as we said, this was a grant, so it does not need to be repaid. But what we do understand is that if you received a PPP loan, the current guidance indicates that the EIDL grant will offset the PPP funds that you received. So this means some of your PPP may not be forgiven. In other words, any amount you received as an EIDL may then need to be repaid to the PPP loan. realizing that the loan is still, you know, a 1% interest rate. So again, that extra funds may be worthwhile to you to run your business than to be paying back. So in the first example we have, Jane receives $3,000 from her EIDL grant and $10,000 from the PPP. Her wages were $8,000. Her rent and utilities were $2,000 during the 8-week forgiveness period. Jane paid her wages and her rent as normal. She spent the $3,000 on supplies during this time. Jane will only have $7,000 of her PPP loan forgiven. How we come up with that is, again, the amount of aid we were supposed to receive for the PPP was supposed to be reduced by any other funding we had received. At the time most of us applied for the PPP loan, we did not know that we received the EIDL money. So when we checked on our application, no, we have not received any other funds. Therefore, we got the full value of our PPP, when in fact, since then, most of us have received some EIDL funds, and therefore that will go against our PPP loan that we received. So example number 2, Jane receives again the $3,000 from the EIDL. She gets the $10,000 from her PPP. Her wages were $10,000 and her rent and utilities totaled $4,000 for the 8-week period. Jane paid her rent and her payroll as normal. What's not clear is if she spent all of her money, of the PPP money, on her covered expenses. There is no official guidance on whether this is forgivable. Since her covered expenses were $14,000 and she used 13 of that, the $3,000 from the EIDL may not be forgiven due to the fact that she spent the money on PPP covered expenses. And also, the $10,000 wages that Jane received would have been her entire PPP loan. And remember, we were told originally that our PPP loan was 75% payroll, 25% rent and utilities. Jury is still out on whether or not this will be forgiven, but I did want to bring it to your attention so that you can consider those facts when you're going about spending the funds that you've received. So at the time of filming, as you know, well, maybe you don't know, that Joe and I are out this week and Vernon is in charge. So we have videoed this presentation for you, which will be shown during our normal Wednesday webinar hour. So there'll be no questions answered during this time. But if you do have questions, please feel free to send them along, and we will be sure to get those answers out to you. We have heard that the House is expected to vote on the HEROES Act today. As of this recording, we have still not heard what happened with that vote. Unclear whether the Senate will pass it or if the President will sign it. This legislation would bring about the following: another round of stimulus checks, some student loan forgiveness, which I think is much needed, and money for local governments and government programs within the different states. So stay tuned. We'll be sure to update you as that information comes across our desk. Thank you all, and happy Memorial Day.